Hello, everyone. Warm welcome to everyone joining us today for this webinar, From Waivers to Scale, How Beyond Visual Line of Sight, or BVLOS modernizes America's low-altitude infrastructure. My name is Dominic Mathew, and I'm the Transportation Policy Manager at SAFE's Coalition for Reimagined Mobility. In terms of the agenda for the next 60 minutes, I will give you a high-level summary of the policy brief that we are launching today during this webinar. Then we will transition to a panel discussion with practitioners who will tell the audience all the exciting ways that they're using drones in their work and the impact that BVLOS would have on them. So before we start off, a brief introduction on about who we are and what we do. SAFE is a nonpartisan group that has spent the last 20 years influencing policy at the intersection of energy and national security. SAFE is guided by the Energy Security Leadership Council, a unique group of Fortune 500 CEOs and retired four-star military leaders. Within the SAFE ecosystem, the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility, or ReMo for short, advances US leadership at the intersection of transportation, energy, and emerging technologies, including AI, autonomous vehicles, and drones that we are talking about today. All of this to build a globally competitive, secure, and connected transportation system. So we will start off with just laying the baseline and giving some context. So what is BVLOS? To put it very simply, given the audience that we have today coming in from a variety of industries, BVLOS allows a drone pilot to fly their drone beyond what their eyes can see. Today's rules, which is Federal Rule Part 107, was made with safety in mind, as are all FAA rules, but they also restrict or limit drones to short and fragmented flights. That being said, there are always exceptions and caveats, this being aviation, and one can get a bespoke BVLOS waiver. But as we found out in interviews with various stakeholders, it can be an expensive process, almost costing up to $100,000 to get that waiver, and it's also very resource and time intensive. So moving to what Part 108, as you have there on the slide, is this is the proposed federal regulation that would enable BVLOS at scale. It's been in the making for a decade, and the FAA released a draft which still has some gaps to be addressed. But what Part 108 would do is ideally remove the waiver level burdens that you have right now and move towards standardizing and scaling BVLOS flights. Part 146 is the proposed rule that provides a digital backbone where flight information can be shared to make sure that BVLOS operations are scaled safely. And so the big takeaway from this slide is if you get 108 right, you pair it with 146, what starts happening is drones then start becoming part of the transportation infrastructure. And that's where the real impact begins. And that is why in this policy brief, we state that BVLOS is not just an aviation route. It has the potential to define infrastructure and industrial policy, given that it affects so many different industries, including not just civilian, but military use cases too. And we are seeing drones reshape both on the commercial side of things and modern warfare, but US commercial scale is still constrained by the rules that I mentioned before, the Part 107s built for short-range flights. And it's not like there is no demand. As you see from those numbers, between 2020 and 2023, the Federal Aviation Administration's BVLOS waivers increased by 22 times. And on the other hand, we are approaching 1 million commercial drones in the US by 2027. So the problem isn't demand, it's repeatability and having a standardized framework to take those long flights beyond the pilot's visual range. And when commercial scale stalls, so does the industrial investment, because that then directly affects defense readiness and supply chain resilience. So in the brief, this is the meaty part of the brief where we talk about the three areas where impact shows up most clearly when BVLOS comes into play. It is resilience, scale, and competitiveness. Within the resilient critical infrastructure bucket, energy networks in agriculture show the most potential for BVLOS operations. In energy networks, for instance, utilities still rely on helicopters for corridor inspections, and this could be very expensive, costing anywhere between $1,200 to $1,500 per mile, compared to using drones fitted with LiDAR thermal imaging for the same use case, but comes in at $200 per mile, which is a very big cost differential. In the brief, we also cite the use of drones by the Virginia Department of Energy. They use drones to map abandoned mines and determine whether these can be remediated. So just from an energy perspective, from a grid perspective, from a look at how energy infrastructure is maintained, inspected, drones play a very big role, or could play a very big role once BVLOS comes into play. On the other hand, in agriculture, the safety story came out in a very big way. And you'll hear from Lukas in a couple of minutes on the ag side. But crop dusters, which are small planes that apply pesticides, insecticides, and seed crops, and fly below 500 feet at very low altitudes, are very prone to wire strikes and terrain collisions. It is, as I found out very surprisingly, one of the most dangerous aviation activities, with nearly a dozen fatalities every year. And so what BVLOS does is it enables safer, at least on the agriculture side, safer, longer operations, and also precision spraying, cutting the use of water and chemicals by almost 80%. The second impact area is scaling BVLOS across public safety and essential services. The most compelling pattern here is not just better aerial visibility, it's faster triage and smarter dispatch. For example, to faster response times. The Irving Police Department in Texas had a classic case where their drones could respond to a priority call within 3.5 minutes, compared to the 10 minutes that it would take for a patrol officer to reach the incident site. So this speed fundamentally changes emergency response times. And it's also visible in some of our other use cases that we show from Texas. The TxDOT used drones equipped with thermal sensors and LiDAR to rapidly search for rapid search and recovery operations, and also to inspect infrastructure in dangerous terrain, so to make sure that a bridge is functioning fine post-flooding for cars or trucks to move on. On the medical logistics side of things, we will hear from Kevin Meyer on the Matador US Consortium, which is exploring how BVLOS could improve rural access to organ transplants, blood, and tissue transport. Finally, the third impact area is competitiveness. A workable BVLOS rule serves as a very good demand signal for a trusted domestic drone industrial base, which in turn drives skilled workforce development and supply chain resilience. Today, China dominates a lot of the processing and refining of critical minerals that are used to make drone components, and which could be anything from batteries, sensors, brushless motors, cameras. So it's done a lot of work inside of things. So we've done a lot of work exploring how Chinese firms dominate roughly 95% of the US consumer drone market right now, benefiting from a vertically integrated, state-subsidized ecosystem. And that means that it's not a secret, but a lot of the Chinese drones that you find right now at the price point, at the tech offered, tend to do very well in comparison to alternatives. And this is because US manufacturers face higher input costs. They have limited component availability, and there is supply chain friction. And so if we want a trusted dual use industrial base, we need predictable demand, not just procurement restrictions. And in our opinion, BVLOS is what creates that market certainty. And so across resilience, scale, and competitiveness, we find that the technology works. We find that the economics are proven and the use cases are real. And what unlocks all three is a predictable, workable BVLOS rule. And so coming to the concluding slide, before we get into the panel discussion, the way forward is very clear. And there are clear asks from policymakers and federal agencies that are working on the BVLOS rule. The first one is finalize BVLOS in a workable form and on a predictable timeline, because certainty unlocks investment. The second takeaway is make interoperability a function and not a bug, because scale cannot happen in digital silos, and Part 146 will play a crucial role in this. And the third point being, we need to translate regulatory clarity into industrial capacity. And if we get all of this right, BVLOS becomes more than an aviation rule. It becomes a force multiplier for infrastructure resilience, for public safety, and American competitiveness. And so with that, that's exactly why we have a great panel to discuss all these good points. I will be transitioning over for the second part of this webinar to Miriam McNabb, who will moderate a discussion with this group of experts. Miriam is the editor-in-chief of droneslife.com and has been writing extensively on drones and UAS for a very long time. And so handing it over to Miriam.
Thanks very much, Dominic. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am honored to be moderating this panel of industry experts and thought leaders. With me today, Liz Forro, Policy Director of the Commercial Drone Alliance. Liz, if you could give a little wave. Lukas Koch, CEO, Kelly Hills Unmanned Systems and CTO of Heinen Brothers Agra Services. Kevin Meyer, President and CEO of LifeGift. And as we've heard from, Dominic Mathew, Manager of Transportation and Policy and Strategy from SAFE's Coalition for Reimagined Mobility. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to start with Liz. Liz, you are a well-known name in the drone industry. I've written about you many, many times, and we've met several times on the road. You and this Commercial Drone Alliance did have a pivotal role in developing this NPRM, or Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Your membership includes big, small, medium-sized drone companies, operators, support providers. So what does a working BVLOS rule mean to your stakeholders?
Yes, thanks, Miriam, and thank you to SAFE and the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility, Dominic, for all of the work on this report. It's really incredible to have numbers behind what I know the CDA has been advocating for many, many years now. And Miriam, yes, absolutely. Our members represent, the full spectrum of sizes. We represent all, market sectors that are using drones. And the biggest barriers that we see preventing companies, regardless of size, from scaling is kind of three things that we really are hoping the rule addresses. One, the path to safety, the path to meeting the FAA's expectations for safe operations is clear. If I want to start a business, I know what the requirements are up front. Second, I know what the costs are to comply with those regulations, and those costs are commensurate with the risks that I'm introducing. And third, the timelines are known and predictable. For businesses to make business decisions, the costs, the requirements, and the timelines are three of the pillars for running a successful business. And so that's really what we're hoping to see from a final rule. I think it's also important to recognize that for those of us who have been in this space for a long time, drones are aircraft. But to a lot of professionals, and Lukas and I have talked about this several times, in other industries, they're a tool. And I think We also hope to see the FAA continue to shift the onus of safety onto manufacturers to build safe and highly automated tools, rather than assume that everyone who's potentially using them is going to read the entirety of what I'm sure may be a 1,000-page final rule. So that's something that I think, from our membership standpoint, we're hopeful. I think we're actively advocating in that direction.
Okay. So for those in the audience who don't make their living in the drone space, I want to move to Lukas and Kevin now to give a little bit of framework around what the impact is to the American consumer and the American citizen, because drones are have the potential to be a really important part of our infrastructure. So Lukas, I'm going to start with you. Kelly Hills is a subsidiary of Heinen Brothers, largest privately held aerial application company, aerial of agricultural products, right, in the United States, and Kelly Hills as an advanced drone technology business. So you are working sort of at that intersection of how agriculture and drones come together. Tell us a little bit about what the advantages of using drones versus the traditional manned aircraft crop sprayer.
For sure. Yeah. Thanks, Miriam. One of the main advantages of using drones that we've seen over kind of how this has unfolded over the last 6 or 7 years is an introduction to new tools into our airspace. So traditionally, you'd see aircraft like the one behind me operating at very low altitudes, right? 10 feet above the crop, zipping along at 150 to 200 miles an hour, working hard to protect America's food supply during key parts of the growing season. Being an aerial applicator pilot is very dangerous work, and it's highly technical, right? Because you're so close to the ground, going so fast with new obstacles that are present in low altitude airspace, but not necessarily up high. And so drones have been adopted and used in particular in farming to try to manage some of the smaller areas or the more dangerous areas. It's been a fantastic tool for service providers such as ourselves, but also our clients, the farmers, being able to manage some of their small fields or more dangerous areas as well. And ultimately, what we're seeing is it's just unlocking more opportunity in our space and opportunity for new products, right? So if you look at aerial application as a whole over its last 105-year history, it's been steady incline, a lot of breakthroughs and cool technologies. And we see that continue to be pushed in, new biological markets or seeding and cover cropping methods. So it's opening up the opportunity for farmers to find new sources of revenue on their farm by utilizing these tools.
I think too, we have to touch on precision agriculture here. I've had the opportunity to travel all over the world. I know the World Bank specifically brings out precision agriculture as a very important tool in preserving the food supply globally. So, when we talk about the scale of drones now, we're really at this amazing point where AI tools and software ecosystem and drones are coming together to really provide value. So touch a little bit on how precision agriculture is kind of a way of allowing farmers to save resources and produce better crops.
For sure. Yeah, the push for more precision agriculture practices is kind of leading the charge in this initiative. And it is crazy. We're seeing tens of thousands of drones being operated by farmers. And these are fairly large drones, right? They weigh up to 500 pounds and they're applying many acres per hour, flying around in the United States to do this type of precision agriculture work. But remarkably, we are still very early in the technology adoption period. So you can hop online and see the buzz about how these large drones are being used in agriculture. But there's bigger drones coming with more capabilities, and those are pivoting, or it's a pivotal moment for them to see Part 108 come to fruition, because that allows for the unlocking of these capabilities in a more meaningful and broad way. And that will allow kind of our whole industry to transition this technology from the enthusiast phase of the technology adoption curve into the early adopters, and most importantly, across the chasm, which is really the big key moment when technology finally hits its stride. And so we're still before the chasm, and I do believe that this regulation Part 108 will be the key unlock for that, and we'll see just massive amounts of production to follow after that.
Great. Okay, Kevin Meyer, you are President and CEO of LifeGift. LifeGift is a nonprofit organ procurement organization facilitating those critical organ, eye, and tissue donations across Texas. LifeGift is a founding member of the Matador UAS Consortium, which is utilizing drones to improve medical access for rural and underserved communities. And this is really pioneering work. We've seen this overseas in Africa, which was sort of the point of the spear for this kind of work. And so being able to bring that to underserved communities in the United States is really amazing. How do you view drones as kind of a game-changing technology for the work that you are doing?
Yeah, thanks, Miriam, and thanks for inviting me to this discussion. It's fascinating. So the use of drone technology and what we work with organ donation and transplantation, there's really two sides to this. I think when you hear about drones and transplantation, immediately people think about moving a kidney, for a donated human kidney, for transplant from one place to another. But actually, it's sort of further upstream, not only with people who are waiting for transplantation, so candidates in rural areas of America and in our world in West Texas and eastern New Mexico, where distances are so vast, who need to have immune monitoring, so blood samples and so forth. So the idea that we can use drone technology to move those blood samples from where the individual lives to where a laboratory is, both for people who are waiting, as well as for people who have already had transplants and their drug levels are being monitored. We also have a huge problem with access in that particular area, where we have people with end-stage renal disease who are on dialysis, but they don't want to drive the 4 to 6 hours into a lab for or even into a center for dialysis. So they decide not to even get put on the transplant waiting list, which is a real shame. So our notion was to use the drone technology in these rural areas to help move those blood samples. Now, when you move into the organ donor cases where time is very, very critical, time is limited, and that's what we're always sort of fighting against. The idea that when you start working on an organ donor case, we have to do testing for infectious disease and other types of blood samples, blood typing. What we use right now is ground transportation or commercial air. And there aren't a whole lot of commercial air. There's not as much commercial air transportation access, and using private charter is very expensive. So the idea is, can we use drones to advance and accelerate the front side of the case for laboratory testing and so forth? And then in a little bit, we can talk about moving kidneys if you want. But it is absolutely critical to helping move along the process of very complicated, organ donor cases, anywhere in the U.S., particularly in the rural areas.
Okay, that is really exciting stuff. Kind of opens up a lot of possibilities when you talk about flying as the crow flies instead of having to navigate existing transportation infrastructure.
Sure.
Before I move on to the next question, I just want to remind anybody in the audience, if you do have a question, please put them into the Q&A. We will be addressing as many of those as we can at the end of the session. Dominic, I'm going to move on to you to introduce sort of another aspect of this whole conversation, and then we will kind of all come together to attack the issue of the BVLOS NPRM from our different our different perspectives here. But I want to kind of get started with you from an energy security audience. So what are the biggest near-term potential gains? Why do your stakeholders find a BVLOS rule critical?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that, Miriam. That question's super interesting because, as I mentioned before, SAFE comes in from this energy security perspective, and ReMo, the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility, kind of adds on the transportation layer on top of that. So from a near-term BVLOS gain perspective, I feel just looking at the energy grid, how it's performing right now, you have multiple things poking at the grid right now. There's AI data center usage. And in a lot of places, the grid is training already. And so how do you keep every inch of the grid that's out there running well and functioning well? I feel BVLOS has a huge advantage there because you're essentially using drones to inspect, monitor the grid as it's functioning and as it's working to see and maintain and detect any discrepancies that might be coming up in the grid. And so I mentioned the helicopter inspection numbers, how helicopters currently do a lot of line inspection, but how they could be either supplemented or complemented with drones, but at a lower cost. You also have, I think, numbers in the brief where we talk about power outages and the amount that they cost to the US economy on an annual basis, anywhere around 150 billion every year. That's a huge number. And if you could use drones to monitor and reduce that impact and detect problems from before they happen, and doing it safely while not requiring, say, a person to be flying a helicopter or a person sitting in a bucket truck going up and checking on a transmission tower. I think that's a fantastic use and a near-term gain from a BVLOS perspective. I would also extend that onto oil and gas, methane leak detections. We spoke with stakeholders who are using drones fitted with LiDAR thermal imaging and detecting these leaks very early on and not having to send a person out there on the ground. I think that's a great safety use case that's coming up as well. And so just from that perspective, I think the energy security piece, the monitoring, inspection, detecting trouble before it happens is a great use case.
Okay. So I'm going to shift this. I'm going to start here with Liz from the policy perspective of what the notice of proposed rulemaking actually says about what the rule will eventually look like. And then I want to ask each of you as respective stakeholders, Lukas, Kevin, and Dominic, where the money is, right? Where's the actual monetary benefit in being able to use drones beyond visual line of sight rather than whatever solutions you're using right now to perform your functions? So Liz, starting with you, when we talk about BVLOS flight and the NPRM, one of the major concerns that I hear reflected from stakeholders all across the industry is the way it works now is you have to get a waiver to fly beyond visual line of sight. And while the FAA has made huge efforts to try and streamline this process, if you're trying to do anything, even the slightest bit unusual, or unusual only in the sense that it hasn't been done before, it's still very expensive and it can be very slow and time consuming. How do we build the final BVLOS rule so that it doesn't just continue to require tremendous effort from the stakeholders to get to BVLOS flight?
Yeah, it's a great question, Miriam, and a really important aspect of this rule. I think that was obviously one of the things that we noted in talking to our members about the proposal was that, the FAA has, to your point, made an enormous amount of progress in the last year to 2 years in terms of the number of waivers they're issuing, which the report also highlighted, but is also the precedent-setting nature of some of those waivers, right? They're really pushing the boundaries through some of these case-by-case approvals, which we're thrilled to see. And we need that rule to start from a place that moves us forward from those waivers, right? If you think about the sort of, line that we're trying to hold, what we saw was a proposal that was a little bit dated in terms of where they snapped that chalk line, right? And so hopefully they'll be able to, build that final rule out, starting with, the sort of volume and waivers and the policy that they've built over the last year or two. But the way that we ultimately, need to push that envelope really comes down to what makes this rule unique and different from both, Part 107 as well as Part 91 and some of the other, standard aviation rules. The unique and really cool thing in this rule is the way that the FAA is thinking about the aircraft. So in Part 107, what we have in that rule is a rule that the FAA says, if it's below 55 pounds, we're not going to, invest heavy resources in looking at the aircraft. We're going to control risk by limiting the operational envelope. So you can't do that much to, to Dominic's presentation point. You're limited to how far away the drone can fly. And largely that's because the FAA is doing, there's really no requirements on the aircraft other than that the pilot ensure that it's in a safe condition before flight. In Part 91, in, standard aviation, there is some kind of airworthiness process, and it's usually ends up with a certificate issued, right? An airworthiness certificate issued to the aircraft that's specific to that aircraft. Its design is certified by the FAA. Its manufacturer is certified by the FAA, and there's a decent amount of rigor that goes into that increases with the level of risk being presented. The FAA acknowledged in this NPRM that they know that Part 108 and BVLOS UAS sits somewhere between 107 and this, standard aviation, which kind of starts with Part 91 and light sport aircraft. So what they did was they put in place, or they proposed an industry consensus standard, based approval process for the airworthiness. So they're taking more of a touch than 107. Slightly less of a touch, than light sport aircraft and standard aviation, but there's still some rigor applied to the aircraft. And what that means is, from an operational standpoint, we can do more, right? So if we're controlling more of the risk on the aircraft side, we can obviously expand the operational envelope. And they put in place some parameters around automation, which again, controls some risk from human error and requires that the aircraft be designed safely to function safely, and not just, relying on the skill of a pilot or a person to fly it. It's a real step forward in terms of how the FAA is thinking about automation in aviation. It's a good indicator for some of the more advanced aviation concepts that we're seeing beyond Part 108. And I'm really, really hopeful that we see some of the changes in that airworthiness process that we proposed, because it's almost there, but there are some big changes that need to happen, because I think the FAA is still, they're still in their traditional aviation aircraft mentality, and we need them to shift a little bit more into understanding, and as I think we're going to talk about later, the demand and volume of production that we could potentially see needed to support this final rule.
Okay, thank you very much. You gave me a great transition here, because when we're talking about the demand and the impact and the real volume of flights here across industries, I really want to get to something that Dominic was actually the person who kind of came out with this. What is the AHA metric for example, we'll start with you, Lukas, for farmers? So we've talked about the benefits in terms of safety. It's really clear, but what's the sort of, when you say, okay, it'll cost you this using traditional methods and this using drone flight, is it because it does fewer passes? Is it because it's just moves faster? Is it because you need a different kind of pilot? What's the real cost savings, the impact metric there for farmers?
Sure. Yeah. Yep. For farmers, and people in the agricultural industry, the aha moment, or kind of the, you know, the metric that begins to change and kind of swing a different way than it has historically, is just access to timing of certain tools. So when you think about growing crops in certain seasons, especially even if you have house plants, right? When you start to notice a certain bug or fungus that begins to grow, kind of got to take action on that promptly in whichever way you prefer. If you wait because of rain or due to a lack of tools or service providers in your area, then that infestation will continue to grow and affect your crops. So what we're seeing is access to these tools in a very timely way, specifically drones. You don't have to drive through your muddy field. You can just fly from the edge. And sometimes if the service providers are tied up in other places, which happens frequently, then you now have the ability to control that service by yourself. Some success cases we've seen, particularly one of my favorite farmers that we work with out in North Carolina, has seen over 3 times the amount of production because he's able to kind of spoon feed and work with the plant to give it its certain micronutrients at the correct time, instead of trying to do it all in one pass with traditional tools. So he's big on using new technology, but also using old methods, right? Read the plant, understand what it needs, and give it what it needs. You don't necessarily need to make the agronomic side too difficult, but the new tools are helping him, you know, grow his farm. So in agriculture, we're seeing a really big challenge right now in transitioning farms. So farms are essentially, they're a business, and transitioning that from one generation to the other becomes very difficult just due to taxes and land values and things of that nature. So if we can see new tools adopted, such as drones and other robotics, and they're finding ways to get 1.5 or 2 times more yield and profit off of their ground, then that kind of opens up the aperture a little bit for new farmers as well, which is kind of a growing epidemic. I mean, the average age of an aerial application pilot is quite high, nearly 60, and the average age of a farmer in America is very high as well. So these are important tools, and hopefully not a too little, too late moment, because I think there's still time.
Excellent. Excellent. Kevin, this is almost not fair to ask you, because when you talk about impact, you are talking about directly to human lives. So we understand this is sort of life and death stuff here, but can you give us sort of an idea of what's the speech that you give people to explain why you're committed to the use of drones for what you do?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And it's actually parallel in some ways to what Lukas was talking about in terms of access. So there's an access component to people who need transplantation, as I was mentioning, you know, making blood sample collection and delivery easier. That's the first thing. Second thing is reliability. So most deceased organ donors are in larger hospitals and larger population areas, right? And most transplant centers are in large population areas with larger hospital systems, right? And so what goes between those cities? Railroad tracks. And so that makes gives us the potential for increased reliability versus having to, you know, drive blood samples or eventually a kidney to an airport, you know, all the stages, we all fly commercially. And then many of those flights are subject to things that happen, you know, again, way up the, you know, sort of the food chain, if you will, of air transportation networks and so forth. So having the ability to have reliability and then costs. So all costs associated with kidney transplantation generally are reimbursable by CMS and Medicare. So the cost per mile, if you will, is much lower compared to charter aircraft. And even to some degree, is this scales to, you know, private sort of courier delivery. So it really, there's, you know, multiple domains where we think this is worthwhile and we can measure it and show benefit.
Okay. And Dominic, I'm going to touch on you. I know you did mention a lot of the benefits. What's the AHA metric for the energy industry?
I think not just the energy industry, but broadly as well. I feel using BVLOS as a demand signal that could uh, create a predictable demand because, and I'll just relate one story that I heard, one and many stories that I heard from stakeholders during our interviews of how American-built startups functioning out of the US are forced to look for global markets or look towards external markets because their customers have to go through a tremendous amount of waivers, which are expensive to, I believe, Liz's point, expensive, time-consuming, resource-intensive. And so you're seeing a situation where a drone that's built in the US is struggling to find customers here because of this long process and would simply end up selling outside the US because that's a much easier sell. And so in terms of the AHA metric, I feel having a workable BVLOS come into play sets a clear demand signal. And we talk about this in the brief about how China has done this really well. It's taken decades. It's taken them almost 50 years. If you look at Shenzhen as the Chinese Silicon Valley, it was demarcated as a special economic zone way back in the late 80s. And they've had tremendous investment coming in, state targeted investments coming in, which has now made the area a very tightly run, vertically integrated hub for everything from electric cars to mobile phones to drones. I think the story is that if you call up a supplier in Shenzhen overnight and ask them to make 1,000 drones by morning, customize it to your liking, they will probably have that ready. And so how do you replicate something like that in the United States, but have trusted sourcing, have predictable demand in place that might come through BVLOS? I feel that then completes the ecosystem of creating a drone industry that's domestic, that has a secure supply chain, has trusted sourcing coming in. And so I feel BVLOS fits in a bigger puzzle of looking at how do you transition the drone industry into a domestic built, dual use industrial base.
Okay, so let me grab that transition then, and let's move into talking about this. So for anyone in the audience who is not aware, recently the United States FCC issued an update to their covered list, which said that they would no longer approve foreign-made drones or drones made with foreign components. And I'll ask Liz to do the plain English translation of that, but let me stick with that for just 1 second, because an interesting thing that the FCC said in their notification of this move was that they framed the conversation not as foreign drones cause a security security issue because they're spying on you or anything, but just the US not having its own drone industry is a risk for us in this world where any conflict heavily relies upon drones. So Liz, let's start with you. Tell everybody, what does the FCC's covered list updates mean about the supply chain conversation for drones in the really immediate future here? We're talking about the next 12 to 24 months.
Yes. So first of all, this
got another
policy...
2 hours.
I was going to say we could have a webinar entirely on this subject alone. So, I mean, I think we all recognize that this policy represents an admirable objective. I think every company that we've talked to, every operator, every manufacturer would love to have a fully domestic supply chain. The savings on shipping and logistics alone, right, would be astronomical. I think we're all also aware that we don't have that today. And so as companies are thinking about this, one of the things that we've been communicating in our meetings with policymakers is there's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation here. So this policy is future looking, meaning that if you have an FCC authorization already, or a product has an FCC authorization already, it doesn't lose that authorization. But moving forward, the FCC will not issue authorizations, either integrated system authorizations for foreign drone, platforms, or specific, authorizations for modular transmitters that are foreign made. There are obviously a couple exceptions that are already written into the policy, one for blue list UAS, as well as for UAS that meet the UAS and critical components that meet the definition of a domestic end product. Those are only 1-year exceptions, though. And so what we're sort of seeing here is a big bet basically being placed on American manufacturing prowess. By forcing all the players in this space to transition theoretically on the same timelines to more domestic sourcing, they're betting that the aggregate demand volume will be enough to induce private industry and investment to create that supply. The challenge, of course, is, to Dominic's point, that the regulatory environment that we have right now is working against that demand signal. Operators don't have necessarily the ability to scale operations. That lessens, orders for systems. Manufacturers don't have assured sales, so they can't order components in bulk or too far in advance. So we end up kind of in this supply-demand doom loop. I think a lot of companies right now are still in the discovery phase of this. They're exploring their options. Vendors are talking prices and timelines. We're seeing some uncertainty in the industry. So I think companies and obviously associations are working on getting more clarity for their members. But I do think ultimately a large part of this equation is going to be on the FAA's shoulders to finalize a BVLOS rule that can support the demand side of the equation. And maybe I'm an optimist, but I think they're up to the task. So we have a lot of work to do over the next 12 to 24 months, but I think we can do it if we do it together.
Okay, and Dominic, does that really match sort of your view of how the, BVLOS, the demand signal and the BVLOS rule kind of go together to support that US industry?
Yeah, I think it's signaling at this point. It's creating that demand, or at least creating that certainty through regulation that others can then pick off and then go ahead and do what they need to do.
And just to give everybody sort of an idea of where we are now, Lukas, without naming names, do you think most farmers are using domestically produced drones right now, or are they reliant on foreign airframes?
For sure, right now, especially over the last 5 years, they're using, drones made in other countries, primarily China. I mean, DJI just has a really good product packaging together technologies that were developed in countries like the United States, and they just beat us on the manufacturing side, and they did a great job doing that. I would say much to my, I'm not going to say surprise, but much to my delight, the response from the agricultural drone manufacturers over the last 2 months, after hearing that FCC kind of direction and decision has been good. And so we're seeing kind of the spirit of entrepreneurialism and capitalism rise to the front, and a lot of companies who have been sitting and waiting for some clarity, because there's always been concerns that you'll create a cool drone and technology and it could get replicated in a different country and kind of used against you at a much cheaper price in the United States. And the businesses have to have, some finances to stand on. And we've seen very good response over the last 2 months of new software, new drones, new technology. There's still a ways to go in terms of regulatory side and manufacturing capabilities, all of those things. But right now, farmers are kind of getting introduced to some of the new players in the market. Some are made in the United States, some are made in friendly countries. And at the trade shows, as of late, wintertime is a big time for trade shows for agriculture folks. There's been very good response, and people are interested in those. So I think there's a great opportunity for those entrepreneurs who are taking that chance and those farmers who are looking to new tools to help them solve this problem.
And Kevin, of course, in your industry, you have very specialized needs for how these aircraft can, what they can transport and how that needs to be done. For the most part, are people relying on foreign-made airframes or domestically produced ones? Or do you see any new ones coming out?
Miriam, and my sort of world, that's kind of invisible to me, honestly. That's what, we rely on you guys for. I mean, the experts around that. So I don't know the answer to that, but I would assume they would parallel other aspects of healthcare delivery and also.
Yeah.
One thing too, Miriam, while I'm at it, we're doing everything we can in the United States and across the world, but especially in the US, to try to increase organ donation, right? For all of us to register as donors and so forth, and to, increase the public trust in what we're doing. And that's where this reliability piece comes in, is assuring that this, incredible gift gets to where it's supposed to go on time. And what has also started to happen in our world, in terms of our consortium and so forth, we started out with thinking about blood samples and that capacity. And then we started thinking about more distance. And as we start getting into kidneys available for transplant, we need to scale up in terms of the size and the distance, the range of the aircraft. And so we're moving into that area of the ability to move these kidneys. We've done practice runs, we've done, work around that. And it's been really, really fascinating to see how this teeny, subset of the medical world is, moving into the use of drones and the BVLOS stuff, to, really help accomplish our mission, again, in a more reliable manner. And we think more cost effective. This should save the federal government money by reducing the total transportation charges that we have in moving blood samples, and kidneys available for transplant.
Absolutely. And I think it's really exciting to see some of the trials that are actually going on and kind of proving those metrics. So that's more exciting work to me than burrito delivery, which is also happening, but
We think that.
a little less critical, right? Right. Okay, so I want to wrap up here pretty soon. We are at about 5 minutes from the top of the hour. I have one more kind of question to, I'll start with you, Liz, we'll see, and then I do want to go into our lightning round at the end. But what does workable mean? So what does it mean for an operator in any industry, whether they are in agriculture or in energy or in the medical delivery field or medical logistics? What does it mean to have a workable rule? What changes from today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, obviously, I think as everyone has highlighted, moving away from case-by-case approvals, having predictability, I would say, the idea or ideal state, as I would kind of say, is to honestly have as light a touch from the government as possible. So the more, exchange of information that has to be done with the federal government, the slower the process becomes. And that's not specific to the FAA, that's just specific to working with the federal government, right? There's nothing terribly specific about the FAA there. So I think that in terms of workability, I see this kind of in three parts, right? And this is the three parts that Part 108 is designed to regulate. We have manufacturers, we have operators, and we have automated data service providers. From a manufacturing standpoint, workable means that I can produce at the scale of demand. I can have a predictable, process. I know what it takes to get an approval. I don't have to start over every time I make a change. I can iterate and innovate quickly, and I can make safety improvements on my timeline and not wait for, the government to sort of check a box or stamp a paper. I think, we've seen manufacturers really have the expertise to improve safety in their aircraft, and we need to sort of unlock their ability to get those products into hands quickly. From the operator standpoint, obviously it's very simple. When I buy the drone, when I buy the product, I know how I'm supposed to, I know what I'm allowed to do with it. Period. And those requirements are not overly onerous. I don't need to be, an aviation expert to be able to fly safely. From a service provider standpoint, similar to a manufacturing standpoint, I can iterate quickly. I can provide services, to meet demands, and I can make changes and updates, on the timelines that I develop them, not necessarily, needing to wait for the government to approve something on a routine basis. So I think that, from a workability standpoint, that really boils down to quick, predictable, and cost effective. And we can get there. We've all proposed, I think, a healthy amount of changes, but there do need to be changes from that NPRM to make this a workable rule.
Great. Okay, let's wrap this up with just kind of talking about what those changes mean to different stakeholders. So my lightning round question, and I'm actually going to go in the order that you are in my screen. So Lukas, Kevin, Liz, and Dominic. That's the order we're going to go in. If you had Brian Bedford, the FAA administrator, having a coffee with you today, what is the one thing you would ask Mr. Bedford to consider about this NPRM? What's your one message to the FAA? Lukas.
For me, it would be to continue on the path that they've already charted. I feel like it's a step in the correct direction, and we've got to make these types of moves at some point. So it would obviously be encouragement to continue and have a sense of urgency about it. I know they do. And I would just champion that and say, let's keep moving. There's a lot of buy-in from all stakeholders, and we may not get it right the first time, but to take these initial steps is important to help us ultimately getting to the right decision down the road.
Great. Kevin.
Ditto. And then to bring it into our smaller world, give us a waiver, a demonstration project approval to move blood samples using drone over railroad track from Lubbock, Texas to Fort Worth. In Fort Worth, we have our centralized lab where we do critical tissue typing to generate the match. That one thing would be huge to be able to demonstrate that. And it's a very small scale compared to what you all are talking about, but it would be wonderful to be able to do that and actually see the true benefit to patients who are in need of transplantation. That would be wonderful.
Amazing. Liz, you have a whole long list of things you would say.
I would probably bring this back. I know the administrator's job is first and foremost the safety and efficiency of the national airspace system, but I think SAFE's brief here makes a really critical point about how safety in our NAS and the national security of our country are intricately linked. So I would say you got to get this right, not just fast, because if we don't get it right, we could be sacrificing a commercial industry that our defense sector could need in the next 2 to 3 years. We have to have both, and this rule is really, really critical for having a commercial industry moving forward.
Great. And Dominic, I'm going to wrap it up with your final question and then pass over to you to say the ending words.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. I will echo what everyone else said, that the BVLOS rule needs to be expedited on a predictable timeline, but there needs to be the larger ecosystem perspective of how this plays out. Like I said before, this is not just aviation policy at this point. This is turning into industrial and infrastructure policy. How does BVLOS set a demand signal for a domestic drone industrial base, which could be potentially dual use at the end of the day? But to Liz's point, I feel there needs to be a much bigger view of how this will shape up.
Great.
Okay. And with that, I will thank everyone for, well, first of all, thank you to Miriam for moderating this panel. Wonderful discussion, and a huge thank you to all our panelists for coming on board. This has been great. Just feels like chatting with a bunch of friends talking about drones. But also Lukas, Kevin, Liz, interesting to hear everything that you guys are seeing, everything you guys are operating on, putting in application, putting in practice in the air. So thank you, everyone. And a huge thank you to the audience for sitting with us for 60 minutes. You can download a copy of the policy brief using the QR code that's on your screens. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us on that email listed over there. But thank you, everyone, and looking forward to questions and feedback on this webinar moving forward. Have a good, wonderful rest of your day.